There is a block of stone in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon that weighs approximately 1,650 tons. It was cut, dressed, and moved to a platform where it has rested for roughly 2,000 years, and no engineer alive today has produced a satisfying account of how it got there. That is not a fringe claim. That is the position of the site's own excavation record. But here is the thing that keeps me coming back to this subject after a very long career. That block is not the strangest case in this list. It is not even the hardest one to explain. The structures that present harder problems rarely make the documentaries, because understanding those problems requires patience, and patience does not move the same units that a large number does. What I want to do today is take 10 megalithic structures the standard account handles too quickly, slow down at each one, and tell you precisely what we actually know, what the excavation record genuinely cannot account for, and where, in my judgment, the real difficulty lies. Because the real difficulty is almost always more interesting than the one being advertised. My name is Dr. William Carver, and I've spent 40 years with my hands in the sand of ancient Egypt and across megalithic sites on 4 continents besides. I have crouched in the passage at Newgrange on the morning of the winter solstice, when the light comes in exactly as it was designed to come in 5,000 years ago. I have spent field seasons with a measuring tape at sites in southern Turkey that most people have still never heard of, and I have stood in storerooms in 3 countries holding fragments that have not been properly examined since the season they were pulled out of the ground. What I can tell you before we go a single step further into this list is that the wrong story being told about ancient construction is usually not the one the alternative historians are pointing at. It is quieter, less dramatic, and considerably more unsettling. So let us get into it. Begin with Baalbek, in the Bekaa Valley of what is now Lebanon. Because if you are going to talk about megalithic construction honestly, you have to start with the hardest physical fact in the entire subject and not flinch away from it. The site is famous as a Roman temple complex, and that fame is deserved. The temples of Jupiter, Bacchus, and Venus that stand there are among the finest Roman religious architecture that survives anywhere in the world. But the Romans built on top of something. The podium beneath the Temple of Jupiter rests on a foundation course of stones that dwarfs almost everything else in ancient construction. 3 of them, laid end to end in the western retaining wall, weigh between 800 and 1,000 tons each. They are known collectively as the Trilithon. Roman engineering is extraordinarily well documented. We have Vitruvius. We have construction manuals, legionary engineering records, crane specifications recovered from sites across the empire, experimental archaeology going back decades. None of it accounts for moving a block of 800 tons, a third of a mile uphill, and seating it to a tolerance of under an inch against its neighbors. The Romans built their temple on this platform. The record of who built the platform is, at present, silent, and the Trilithon stones are not even the largest ones cut at the site. In the quarry, a short distance away, there are 2 stones that were never moved. One of them is the block I mentioned at the opening of this video. Approximately 1,650 tons, dressed on 5 faces, lying at a slight angle in the cut it was removed from. Abandoned for a reason the quarry record does not explain. A second stone nearby, discovered more recently, may be heavier still. The quarry work is unambiguous. Someone cut these stones with the intention of moving them. The intention is there in the stone itself. The method is not. I want to be careful here, because this is the point where precision matters more than drama. The conventional attribution of the Trilithon to Roman construction has been questioned on archaeological grounds by excavators working the site itself, not by outsiders. The stratigraphy beneath the podium is complicated, and the dating of the foundation course relative to the Roman superstructure has not been definitively settled in the published literature. What can be said with confidence is that the largest dressed stones at Baalbek predate or are coeval with the Roman construction above them, that no Roman text or inscription claims credit for them, and that the engineering required to move them exceeds anything for which we have a documented Roman method at comparable scale. There is one detail about how those trilithon blocks are seated that I want you to hold in mind as we move through this list. The joints between them are tight, multi-angled, and fitted without mortar against irregular rather than flat faces. That approach to jointing appears elsewhere. I will come back to where, because when you see it again, it is going to be somewhere it has no obvious business being. Let me pause here. There are certain things I cannot talk about on YouTube because YouTube doesn't like it. I put all the unfiltered stuff into the 3 volumes on the QR code on screen or the pinned comment with the link. I'll leave it at that. Move now to southern Turkey, to a site called Göbekli Tepe, on a limestone ridge above the Harran Plain, where in 1994 a Kurdish shepherd and a visiting archaeologist between them changed the timeline of human civilization. The conventional account is accurate and genuinely astonishing on its own terms. Göbekli Tepe is the oldest known megalithic complex. The oldest enclosures date to approximately 11,500 years ago, which puts their construction before agriculture, before pottery, before any settled society we previously thought organized enough to coordinate this kind of labor. The T-shaped limestone pillars, the largest of which weigh up to 20 tons, are carved with animal reliefs of real quality. Foxes, boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, and abstract symbols are distributed across the pillars in arrangements that appear deliberate and that several researchers have argued carry astronomical content. That last argument is not settled, and I want to be honest about what settled means in this context. The astronomical hypothesis is a serious proposal with some supporting evidence and significant methodological debate around it. It is not fringe, but it is not consensus either. What is not debated is the organizational fact. Whoever raised Göbekli Tepe mobilized substantial coordinated labor across a long period, quarried and carved and erected pillars of considerable weight, and did all of this before the agricultural revolution that we previously thought was the precondition for that kind of social complexity. The site has inverted a widely held assumption about the sequence of human development. That is a significant thing to have done, and mainstream archaeology has absorbed it, adjusted the model, and continued. The adjustment required was not small, but the detail that holds my attention most is not the age. It is what happened at the end. The site was deliberately buried. Not abandoned, not gradually silted over, not dismantled for building material elsewhere. Buried. The enclosures were filled with rubble, animal bones, and worked flint in a process that appears intentional and organized. And that burial is precisely what preserved the carvings in the condition we found them. Somebody committed the same organizational effort that built the site to the task of entombing it. We do not have a consensus explanation for why. The excavation record documents the act. It does not explain the motive. And because only a fraction of the site has been opened after 30 years of work, and because the funding and the permitting for large-scale excavation in this region are both complicated, most of Göbekli Tepe is still in the ground. Still in the dark, it was deliberately placed in, waiting on the slow arithmetic of field seasons and institutional budgets. That is not suppression. That is archaeology as it actually functions, which is to say slowly and expensively, with a backlog that never quite clears. The site has a modern Turkish name meaning Potbelly Hill, which tells you nothing about its purpose. The excavators who spent years working it used a German technical term for the enclosures in their field notes, Anlagen. The word means installations, not temples, not shrines, installations. Something built to do something. After decades of work by serious people, the best working description available is still a word that describes function without specifying what the function was. Go south and west now. Across the Atlantic in the geographic sense, but considerably further in the temporal one. To the high plain above Cusco, in what is now Peru, where the outer walls of a site called Sacsayhuaman have been quietly embarrassing tidy explanations for a long time. The conventional account attributes the construction to the Inca state, beginning in the late 15th century, using the mita system, a labor conscription that drew workers from across the empire in rotation. That attribution is supported by Spanish colonial records, by Inca oral histories transcribed by chroniclers in the generation after the conquest, and by the archaeology of the site itself. The Inca built Sacsayhuaman. That part is not in serious dispute. What the Inca records also contain, and what tends to be quietly set aside in summary accounts, is the Incas' own description of how the construction was accomplished. Their accounts, as recorded by early Spanish chroniclers who took testimony from people alive during the construction, describe the work as immensely difficult, requiring tens of thousands of workers, taking multiple generations, and involving techniques that included a substance derived from a plant that could, in their account, soften stone to workability. That last detail is almost universally dismissed as legend or metaphor, and it may well be. I am not arguing that the Inca had a chemical process we have lost. What I am noting is that we have chosen to disregard the builder's own account of their own building without disproving it, and that is a methodological habit worth examining. The practical problem at Sacsayhuaman is this. The largest stones in the outer zigzag walls weigh over 100 tons. They are fitted without mortar. That alone is labor-intensive, but mechanically explicable. The harder problem is the nature of the joints. These are not flat stones, fitted against flat stones. They are irregular, multi-angled polygonal blocks fitted against other irregular, multi-angled polygonal blocks, with joints so tight that in many cases a sheet of paper cannot be passed between faces. That fit has held through 5 centuries of Andean seismicity, which is itself one of the most seismically active regions on the planet. Mortar-free, jointing on irregular polygonal faces, at this tolerance, at this scale, is not a problem. I have a satisfying answer for. I have been asking for one for 30 years, and the experimental archaeology literature has not yet closed the gap. Cross the Andes and drop in altitude to the Altiplano of Bolivia, to a site called Puma Punku, part of the larger Tiwanaku complex near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca. The Tiwanaku culture built here across a long span centered roughly on the first millennium of the Common Era. The site includes a class of stone elements known informally as H-blocks, cut from andesite and red sandstone, with geometric profiles of considerable precision, internal right angles, recessed channels of consistent width, and in some cases, mirror-identical profiles across separate blocks that appear to have been designed to interlock. The precision of these cuts has generated a great deal of heated discussion, much of it not useful, because the discussion became entangled early on with claims about technology that the evidence does not support. What I would like to set aside is the overreach. What I would like to sit with is a narrower and more honest question. The tooling marks visible on the Puma Punku blocks are consistent with the stone and bronze tools available to the Tiwanaku. That is the conventional assessment, and it is defensible. What has not been done, to my knowledge, is a rigorous experimental archaeology attempt to replicate a single H-block using period-appropriate tools, document the time and labor required, and publish the result. The attempt would either confirm the conventional account in practical terms or reveal a gap that needs explaining. The absence of the experiment is not evidence that the blocks are inexplicable. It is simply an absence. And in a subject this contested, absences matter. What is also true is that the Tiwanaku site is significantly under-excavated. The permitting environment for fieldwork in this part of Bolivia has been intermittently difficult for decades. The funding has been inconsistent, and what we know about Puma Punku's construction sequence is derived from a relatively small percentage of what is physically there. I want to be direct about what that means. The mystery here is partly a mystery of excavation rather than a mystery of the stones. We cannot answer questions we should be able to answer because the work has not been done. That is a failure of funding and institutional priority, not of concealment. The cost of it is real either way. Come back to Egypt for a moment. Not to the pyramids, but to a quarry in the granite hills above Aswan, where something was begun and then stopped. And the stopping tells us something the completing never would have. The unfinished obelisk lies in its cutting trench, almost as it was left, somewhere around 3,500 years ago. A crack appeared in the granite during the cutting process, and work stopped. The obelisk was never removed. What the quarry gives us, as a result, is one of the clearest direct records of ancient Egyptian stoneworking technique that survives. The oval pounding marks of dolerite working balls, the ramps cut to allow workers to reach the upper surfaces, graffiti left by work gangs, and the full sequence of cuts in progress. The evidence of method is genuinely present and readable. If completed, the obelisk would have weighed approximately 1,200 tons. The next largest obelisk, the Egyptians, actually moved and erected, stands at the Lateran in Rome, and it weighs roughly 455 tons. Between 455 tons and 1,200 tons, the engineering problem does not scale linearly. The forces involved, the equipment required, the organizational complexity of the lift and the river transport and the raising to vertical, grow at a rate that means the jump from the heaviest moved obelisk to the heaviest attempted is not just a larger version of the same problem, it is a different class of problem. And the solution to it, if one existed in the knowledge of New Kingdom Egypt, has not been recovered. I want to say that carefully, because the fringe version of this observation is wrong. The fringe version says they could not have done it. What the evidence actually says is that they believed they could, because they started. They committed the quarry work. They chose the stone and began the cutting with the evident intention of completing and moving a 1,200-ton object. Whatever method they had in mind, or believed they had in mind, was interrupted by the crack. The knowledge of that method, if it existed, did not survive in any document we have found. Those are two different statements, and holding them apart matters. Leave Egypt and cross the Mediterranean to a small island in its center. Malta, 27 kilometers of limestone in the southern sea, with no river transport, no draft animals in its archaeological record for the construction period, and some of the oldest freestanding stone architecture in the world. The Tarxian temples, along with a cluster of related sites across Malta and the smaller island of Gozo, were built between roughly 3,600 and 2,500 before the Common Era, which puts their earliest phases among the oldest above-ground stone structures that survive anywhere. The largest limestone blocks in the temple walls reach approximately 20 tons. In the 1990s, excavations found spherical stone balls in association with the monuments, which gave a plausible and now generally accepted transport mechanism for how those blocks were moved across the island without wheeled vehicles or animal traction. That part of the problem can be considered reasonably addressed. What cannot be addressed as easily is the social question, and I think the social question is the more interesting one. Malta is a small island. The population that built these temples, sustained over a period of more than 1,000 years, was not large. The organizational complexity required to plan, quarry, transport, and raise these structures repeatedly over centuries, without any evidence we have found of a centralized state, without writing, without hereditary kingship in the form that produced comparable monuments elsewhere, is something the archaeology acknowledges and has not resolved. We do not know what held that society together for long enough to build what it built. The monuments survive. The social architecture behind them is invisible to us, and its invisibility is not a small thing. Go south and east to the African continent, to the interior of what is now Zimbabwe, where a medieval stone enclosure has something to teach this list that none of the other sites on it can teach quite as directly. The Great Enclosure at Great Zimbabwe is built from granite blocks shaped by exploiting the natural cleavage planes of the local stone. The outer wall stands 11 meters high, 5 meters thick at the base, several hundred meters in circumference, and was constructed without mortar across a period beginning around the 11th century of the Common Era. It is the largest ancient stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa, and by any measure, it is a significant architectural achievement. The anomaly here is not in the engineering. The anomaly is in the interpretation, and specifically in a century of deliberate misattribution that the archaeology has since corrected. When European colonial scholars first formally examined Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the prevailing position across that literature was that the structure could not have been built by the ancestors of the people living near it. A succession of alternative origins were proposed over several decades: Phoenician traders, ancient Arabians, the civilization of Punt, a southward migration from somewhere more acceptably distant. All of those attributions were wrong. The archaeology accumulated, and it is now unambiguous. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, in the period the radiocarbon dates assign, for reasons that were their own. I include this site in a list about structures we have been told the wrong story about, because the wrong story here was not about engineering capacity or lost civilizations in the fringe sense. It was about who we were willing to credit with sophistication, and it was wrong in a way that had material consequences for the people living near the site during the colonial period. The correction of that wrong story is archaeology doing what it is supposed to do. It took longer than it should have. The cost of the delay belongs in the record alongside the correction. Cross to the Americas and come down from the high altitudes to the Pacific coast lowlands of Costa Rica, to the delta of the Diquís River, where something was made with great care, and then, by a different kind of carelessness, largely lost. The stone spheres of the Diquís Delta are exactly what they sound like: granite spheres, ranging from a few centimeters in diameter to over 2 meters, crafted by the Diquís people in a period roughly spanning 600 to 1000 of the Common Era. Their manufacture by pecking and grinding with harder stone is documented and not seriously disputed. The labor required for the largest of them is substantial, but the method is understood. What is not recoverable for most of the spheres is the context. In the 1930s, the United Fruit Company was clearing the delta for banana cultivation, and the workers encountered the spheres in the ground and moved them. They were rolled aside, used as garden ornaments, placed in front of public buildings, shipped to private collections. By the time archaeologists arrived with the tools and the intent to document the original positions and arrangements, most of the positional information was already gone. The few spheres recorded in situ before they were disturbed appeared to be arranged in lines and geometric patterns. What those patterns meant, whether they tracked astronomical events or marked territorial boundaries or served some ceremonial purpose, is now for most of the field essentially unrecoverable, because the relationship between the objects and the ground they sat in was destroyed by agricultural priority before anyone thought to ask. This is the case I come back to when people ask me what actually destroys the archaeological record. Not government secrecy, not institutional suppression. A company that needed flat land for bananas, and workers who had a job to do, and an absence of anyone on site who understood what questions should have been asked before the first sphere was moved. History is lost that way, far more often than it is hidden. Return to Europe, and go back considerably further in time, to a promontory in the Argolid plain of mainland Greece, where a citadel called Tiryns has been standing since the Bronze Age, and where the stones in its walls earned a name from later Greeks that is worth staying with. Tiryns was a Mycenaean citadel, fortified and expanded across a period roughly spanning the 14th to the 12th centuries before the Common Era. The outer walls are built from limestone blocks that in the largest courses weigh 15 tons or more, laid without mortar in a style that derives its modern name, Cyclopean, from the ancient Greeks themselves. When classical Greeks looked at the walls of Tiryns and similar sites, they said that human beings had not built them. They said the Cyclopes had. Giants, mythological beings of superhuman strength. That attribution is worth sitting with, because the people making it were not naive. Classical Greeks built the Parthenon. They understood corbelled arches and column entasis and the practical engineering of large stone. They were not a people easily confused about what human labor could accomplish. And yet when they looked at the walls of Tiryns, which the archaeology tells us clearly were built by Mycenaean Greeks, the predecessors of classical civilization in the same geography, they reached for myth, not because the blocks were physically impossible to move, because with enough organized labor and the right equipment, 15-ton blocks are within the demonstrated range of Bronze Age construction. They reached for myth because they had no memory of the construction. The knowledge of how it was done had been completely severed. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200, before the Common Era, is one of the most abrupt civilizational failures in the ancient record. Within roughly a generation, palace economies across the eastern Mediterranean failed. Trade networks collapsed. Populations declined sharply. Writing disappeared from Greece for approximately 400 years. By the time Greek literacy resumed and Greek culture re-emerged in something recognizable as classical form, the connection to Mycenaean construction practice was not faded. It was gone. People who were in every meaningful sense the inheritors of the culture that built Tiryns looked at the walls of Tiryns and said that some other kind of being, some stronger and earlier kind, must have put them there. Now here is the thing I asked you to hold from the beginning of this list. The jointing at Baalbek, the way the trilithon stones seat against one another, multi-angled, mortar-free, fitted against irregular rather than flat faces. That same approach appears in the older construction courses at Tiryns. The scale is different, the stone type is different, the cultures are separated by geography and by centuries. But the decision about how stone should meet stone, the preference for an angled and fitted joint over a flat and mortared one, shows up in both places. I am not going to tell you what that means. I genuinely do not know what it means. It may mean nothing more than that certain practical solutions to the problem of fitting heavy stone are arrived at independently by cultures working with similar materials. It may mean something about the transmission of a building tradition that we have not yet traced. What I will say is that it is the kind of observation a careful excavator writes down and does not explain away quickly, because quick explanations for convergences like that tend to be doing more work than the evidence licenses. Close the list in China, in Zhejiang province, with a site that most people in the English-speaking world have still never heard of, and whose obscurity is itself part of what makes it interesting. In 1992, a farmer in Zhejiang province drained a pond to clear land and found himself looking into an enormous artificial cave. Further investigation revealed not one cave but a complex of them. 24 caverns, the largest with a ceiling approximately 30 meters above the floor, with a combined excavated volume estimated at around 1 million cubic meters of sandstone. They have since been dated tentatively to the Qin dynasty period, roughly 2,200 years ago, which would place their construction during one of the most administratively thorough periods in Chinese imperial history. The Qin state and the Han dynasty that followed it kept records, detailed ones, administrative documents, census records, construction accounts for large public works, the mobilization of labor at scale. The terracotta army of the first Qin emperor was recorded. The Great Wall, or the segments of it attributable to this period, appears in the historical literature, a project requiring the removal of 1 million cubic meters of sandstone from a hillside, which would have involved an enormous and sustained labor force, does not appear anywhere in the surviving historical record. No dynasty's official history mentions it. No administrative document identifies a purpose for the caverns. No inscription within them names a patron or a date or a function. The chisel marks on every surface, walls, ceilings, and columns alike follow an identical parallel pattern at a consistent angle across the entire complex. That uniformity suggests either a single, highly organized, sustained effort with a rigid working convention, or a convention maintained so strictly across a long project that the result is visually indistinguishable from the former. No tools have been recovered at the site. No debris field accounting for the removed stone has been identified in the surrounding area, and no formally published explanation for the purpose of the caverns has achieved any significant acceptance. They are not tombs in any recognized sense. They are not mines. They are not the kind of storage facility that Chinese imperial administration is documented as building. The Longyu Caves are accessible. Researchers can enter them. They are not behind a locked door or a permit that has been declined. The anomaly is not sealed. It is simply 2,000 years on and 30 years after discovery, unanswered. In some respects, that is more uncomfortable than a locked door, because a locked door at least implies that someone knows what is on the other side. That is the list as it stands. 10 sites, 10 honest assessments. If you want to go deeper on any of them, the archive on the website has longer pieces on several. The full excavation history at Baalbek, with the stratigraphy laid out in plain terms. The tooling question at Puma Punku, alongside the experimental archaeology literature, and the Longyu Caves, with what documentary record exists, translated and sourced. The link is in the description. No hunt required. Take it or leave it. Now pull back from the individual sites and look at the shape of what we have. In almost every case across this list, the genuine anomaly is not the one the popular version of the story is pointing at. At Baalbek, it is not the weight of the stones alone. It is the absence of a construction record in a broader context, where considerable amounts of ancient construction activity were documented by the cultures involved. At Göbekli Tepe, it is not the age, which is astonishing and real. It is the deliberate burial, which is astonishing and real and almost never discussed in proportion to its significance. At Tiryns, it is not the stones, which Mycenaean laborers demonstrably placed there. It is the speed and completeness with which the knowledge of placing them was severed from the civilization that inherited the site. The real problems across this list are problems about knowledge, how it moves, how it fails to move, how quickly a sophisticated building tradition can go silent within a culture's own continuity. 7 of these 10 sites share one feature that I think is underreported in the standard accounts. The largest, or the most precisely fitted, construction elements are not in the most recent phases of the site's development. They are in the oldest, or among the oldest. In several cases, builders who came later were working around or above courses they did not replicate. They added to the sites. They used them. They sometimes modified them. But they did not reproduce the most demanding elements of what they inherited. That pattern is consistent with something worth naming plainly. Building traditions are learned, and they are learned in chains of transmission, and those chains break. What breaks them is not always catastrophe, though Tiryns shows us that catastrophe is efficient at it. Sometimes a tradition breaks because the social and economic conditions that sustained it change. Sometimes because the institutional memory that carried the precise technique failed to be written down before the last person who held it died. Sometimes, as with the Diki's spheres, because the context that would have allowed us to understand the tradition was destroyed before anyone understood what the context contained. None of that requires a lost civilization. It requires only that knowledge is fragile, which we know from the historical record in multiple places and periods, and that the ancient world developed and lost sophisticated building knowledge more than once, which we also know and tend not to dwell on because it is an uncomfortable thing to sit with. Let me say one honest word before the close, because you deserve it plain. What is solid across this list? The weight anomaly at Baalbek is real and unresolved in the peer-reviewed excavation literature. The deliberate burial at Göbekli Tepe is documented and unexplained. The mortar-free polygonal jointing at Sacsayhuaman presents a genuine engineering problem that experimental archaeology has not closed. The documentation gap at Longyu is real. The misattribution of Great Zimbabwe is historically real and historically consequential, and its correction is the work that honest archaeology is supposed to do. What is speculative? any claim about builders other than the cultures the archaeology assigns them to, any unified theory connecting multiple sites to a single vanished source, any reading of the constructional similarities I noted across several of these sites as anything more than a curiosity warranting further attention. What I will not claim: a lost civilization. Not because I can disprove the possibility. I cannot, and I am not in the business of ruling out what the evidence does not reach. But in 40 years, I have not encountered a piece of evidence for such a thing that survived contact with the actual excavation record. The anomalies in this list do not require one. They require something more modest, and in my view, more interesting. They require us to take seriously how much building knowledge the ancient world developed, how imperfectly it was transmitted, and how efficiently it could disappear. The wrong story being told about these 10 structures is not that ancient people built sophisticated things, because they did, and the documentation of that is extraordinary and speaks for itself. The wrong story is that we have explained them. We have dated most of them. We have attributed most of them correctly. We have not answered the hardest questions they raise about how knowledge moves through time and what happens to it when the chain breaks. The most unsettling thing these stones record is not a mystery about the past. It is a reminder about the present, that what a civilization knows how to do and what it manages to pass forward are not the same thing. They were not the same thing at Tyrans. They were not the same thing in the Dikis Delta. They are not always the same thing now. Next time, I want to take one of these sites and go considerably slower. Baalbek specifically, the full excavation sequence, what the Roman construction levels actually tell us about what they were built upon, and a document that may clarify the dating of the podium, last known to be held in a Lebanese archive, in a condition that makes reading it a serious conservation problem rather than a research one. Not a locked door, a fragile one, which in practice amounts to the same delay for different reasons, with the same cost. Thank you for watching. There is more in the stone.